Hello, we're going to take a look at spawning some important objects in over the next couple of videos. We're going to start with the bullets because they're arguably the simpler of the two, but we're going to do bullets and asteroids. So let's get some visuals first of all. We're going to need something to actually spawn in. So in my sprites folder I have dragged in a bullet and one of the asteroids that I'd picked out from earlier. So just that bullet, and I think it was that asteroid, but just anything, make some up or use a 3D shape if you want to, and let's just drag it onto the screen so we can work with it there. Eventually it's going to be spawned in dynamically with code or instantiated, but to get it working we'll put one on. And note that the bullet also is pointing up the y-axis when really if we were using the rotation of rigid bodies and stuff we would go along the x, but we can work with it. And I'm going to make some code for it. So in the scripts folder I'm going to create a new C# script and call it bullet controller and open it up. So the actual behaviour of the bullet is fairly straightforward. It's going to need a rigid body, we're going to apply some speed to it and then just leave it to it. So it's just going to, the physics system's just going to take over. Once we spawn it, send it on its way, physics system will control it. So we're not going to need the update function. Let's get rid of that. But we are going to need a rigid body. So let's jump back, select the bullet, and we need to add two components now. So add component, let's go physics 2D, and we need some form of collider. Now it's up to you which one you want to use. You might want to make a polygon collider if you've got weird shaped bullets. You could use a circle collider just to use the tip of it or something. But I'm going to use a box collider, and I'm not going to edit the default because that's accurate enough for what I'm after. So we've got a box collider 2D on there, and let's add a physics rigid body 2D. So we've got a 2D collider and a 2D rigid body, and the gravity scale needs to be set to 0. We don't want gravity to affect this bullet, and that's it for now. We will come back and make one little change, but want to see the reason for that before we do. So in the code we're going to store this rigid body just in case we do come back to the bullet at any point. Let's make a private rigid body 2D called RB. And just while we're here, let's also make a public float called speed, so we can change the speed of our bullets from outside, and we'll give it the default of, let's say, 3F. So the bullets are going to move at a rate of 3 units in the physics system, but just before we apply the speed, let's do it without. So in the start function, we're going to grab hold of our rigid body by doing RB equals get component rigid body 2D, and then straight away RB.velocity, not add force, I don't know why I picked that, dot velocity, we could add force, but we're just going to directly set the velocity, equals transform dot up, and that's because the bullet looks up the y-axis, so transform dot up is this direction here. Let's just save that, jump back to Unity, with the laser selected, the bullet selected, make sure that it has that bullet controller applied, and let's give it a try. And we can see that it moves. It doesn't move very quickly, however, so let's apply that speed variable we made. Let's do transform.up times by the speed variable there, and that's public, so we can edit that in Unity if it's not quite right. Give it a try this time, and that's a bit better. It's still a bit slow, so with it selected I'm just going to crank that up to 5. Give that a try. And that's a bit better. So we've got a bullet that has some physical presence and it moves. That's pretty much all we need, but it's not spawning in when we want it to, it's just there. So we're going to amend the player script a little bit to make use of this bullet object. So I'm going to rename the bullet. Instead of using the sprite's name, I'm going to call that bullet, and I'm going to make a prefabs folder to store it in. So back in the root of the assets, I'm going to create a folder, call it prefabs, and I'm going to drag the bullet in there. So we've now got this bullet prefab, and I can delete the original. So we've just got the prefab, and we're going to do it so that when the player presses a button, a certain button, you can pick one, we spawn a bullet and fire it. So let's work on that, which means we need to get the player script open. So make sure you've got your player controller open, And in here we're going to work in the update function, which we deleted a while ago, so let's remake it. Void update. Sorry, we didn't delete it, we just changed its name to fixed update. So fixed update works with the physics, update just works frame by frame. So in here, we're going to ask if we've pushed a certain key, and then we're going to spawn in one of those bullet prefabs. The issue at the moment though is that we don't have any link to that bullet prefab. So right at the top, I'm going to make another public variable, and the type of this is going to be a game object. Public game object, and let's call that bullet prefab. And save that, and then in Unity with your player selected, your spaceship selected, we've now got this extra little bit of information in the player controller component. And it wants a prefab, it wants a game object. So I'm going to grab this bullet, drag it in there, and there we go. Back to the code, we can now use this to make a new copy of it. So in the update function, let's say if brackets input dot get button, instead of get key I'm going to use a get button, so you can use this on a joypad or anything like that. So get button, instead of get button down I'm going to do it while it's held. So to start with it's going to be a bit messy, but later on we'll refine it by having a cooldown on the shooting. So in get button we put a button name, and these are all listed in, if we go to back to Unity, choose edit project settings, we can get the input panel. And by default we've got a few names we could use, like Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3 and Jump. And I'm going to use Jump because by default that's set to the space bar. Play around with your joypad. If you're using a joypad, press the relevant keys to see which one Jump relates to. But for now I'm going to use Jump. Back in the code, get button and then Jump. Close the get button function, close the if, and then do your curly brackets. So here, if we did press that jump button, we want to spawn a new bullet prefab, and we do that using the keyword instantiate. So we're going to make an instance of, and then in brackets we tell it what we want to instantiate, and in this case it's the bullet prefab. So let's give that a try. So now when I press the jump key, which by default is the space bar, we get a bullet. And if I hold it, we get lots of them. And if I fly through that, we get beaten up by our own bullets. So it's pretty cool. It's a bit of a mess. So let's fix it a bit. First of all, let's put a cooldown. In fact, no, let's position the bullet properly. You'll have noticed that they weren't coming out of the spaceship. And that's because we've never told them to. We just told them to spawn. And they're spawning based on where I made that prefab. So they're all stacking up on top of the original position. So what we can do is after this bullet prefab, we can do a comma before the bracket. And it will let us look through the various options. So you've got, the first one is just to put the original object that you want to clone. The second one works the same way. The third one here lets us put the original object and then it gives us 2 extra bits of information. So we can tell it where to be and we can tell it what rotation to have. And we've got both of those in this spaceship. We just want to use the transform.position of our spaceship, and we want to use transform.rotation of our spaceship and apply both of those to the bullet prefab. So instead of spawning where I made it, we're going to spawn it where the spaceship currently is. So let's have a look. So now if I move, rotate and fire, you can see these bullets come out of the spaceship. Now it's weird because they're physical objects, they're bullying my spaceship a little bit. And they're also flooding my memory with all these clones that we'll eventually need to remove when they've gone off screen. But we're getting there. So we'll work on the fire rate first of all, and then we'll worry about the physics of it. So what we need is some way to regulate the speed at which these spawn. We'll do that using a fire rate. So up at the top, we'll make another public variable, public float, called fire rate. And by default, let's say we can shoot 1 every second, so we'll go 1F. And down in the update, we're going to need to monitor this somehow. We're going to need to monitor our progress against this fire rate. So we'll have another, this time we'll have a private variable. So we'll do a private float called next. Let's just call it next. We could call it next shot or next bullet, anything like that, but I'm just going to call it next. And by default that's going to be at 0, so we can fire straight away. There is no time to wait between starting the game and firing our first bullet. So back in the update, let's say if brackets next is greater than 0, so if there is some time to wait, curly brackets there, don't necessarily need them because it's only going to be one line of code here, but we'll do it just because it's what we've been doing all along. If next is greater than 0, we want to reduce it, so next equals next minus, and we're going to use time dot delta time, which is a number that relates to the gap between these update functions being called. So it's the amount of time that's passed between frames. From then on, we could use an else here. So if next is greater than 0, we want to reduce the timer. However, if it's not, so else, we want to do all this stuff. So let's just tab this in a little bit to organise it. And there we go. So if next is greater than 0, reduce it. Else, so if it wasn't greater than 0, if it was less than or equal to 0, and we've pressed the jump button, we're going to spawn a bullet. But what we also need to do in here is when we've fired, we need to add the fire rate back onto next, otherwise we end up spamming. Again, because we're not making any use of the fire rate. So just as we spawn that bullet, let's do next equals next plus fire rate. And that's pretty much everything we need for now. So let's have a look at how that works. So we'll spin and let's fire. And I'm just holding the spacebar here and notice that they are coming out. They're still clashing. The physics is still trying to separate the two objects, which is why the bullets go off at a weird angle and we get that slight jolt as we shoot. We can fix that. We're going to get to that. Just before we leave the script, it's worth pointing out that this else straight into an if can actually be combined into one thing. Instead of going else then if, we can have an else if. Just like that, which sounded like Bob Ross then. We can actually get rid of one of the other brackets because it's just a single else if instead of an else and an if. Yeah. I'm happy enough with that. Let's save it. Let's make sure it works. And it does. The physics is still off. So the last thing we'll do before I finish this video and go on to the asteroids is to sort this clashing we've got. And the reason is the physics, these rigid bodies, the rigid body of the bullet and the rigid body of the spaceship are colliding. And there's a few ways you can fix it. You can actually amend the physics to ignore collisions between certain objects, but we're going to overlook that one just for now. That can go in the asteroids. What we're going to do instead is with the bullet prefab selected, I'm going to tell its collider that it's not actually a physical object, it's a trigger instead. And a trigger, probably more traditionally used to do things like opening doors or just detect when you've gone into a certain area. But a trigger just means it doesn't have a physical effect on the world, it's purely just to see if things are colliding. So by ticking that, pressing play, we no longer get the clash of the physics. So the bullet's still there, we can still use its physical size to see if it's shot an asteroid later on, but we're not getting this fighting effect with the spaceship and the bullet trying to occupy the same physical space. Lastly, the only issue left there really was that the bullet was spawning on top of the ship. So with it selected again, I'm just going to look at this sprite renderer component. We could just change the Z position, but we'd have to do that in the code where we instantiate it. Instead, I'm going to change the order in the layer of the sprite renderer. So 0 is just like the default priority, but as we get higher, the object gets a higher priority. So by going lower with the bullet, putting this to -1, it's less priority than the spaceship itself, which is at the default of 0. So it will spawn behind it, or be rendered behind it even. And there we go. With the obvious exception of the problem with the bullets living forever once they've gone off screen, we're pretty much done there. So for now, I'm going to leave this video there and we'll go on to the asteroids in the next one.